listing an award, an Order of Merit for 2021. Widely recognised as the most important and influential squash and racquetball administrator in Australia, Paul provided his services to the squash and racquetball community since the 1970s until his passing. Paul was initially a tennis player, but converted to squash, quickly finding a passion for the sport, which led him to manage the French Gully Squash Club. He was administrator and main driver of the Victorian Australian Squash Court Owners Association. He identified a need to build a stronger club network and introduce squash time leisure centres, establishing a cooperative commercial model for venues and clubs. During a turbulent time for the VIC Squash Rackets Association, Paul was recruited as its executive director. It merged with Squash Time Leisure and the Victorian Squash Federation was established. Identifying a need for new and diversified revenue opportunities, he introduced the sport of racquetball in 1977 and was GM of the Australian Racquetball Association until his passing. Paul remained as Executive Director of the Victorian Squash Federation for many years. His hands-on leadership and passion ensured the continued development of squash and racquetball. His commitment saw him pioneer many innovative projects, and he led the only Squash Australia affiliated organisation to equally represent the player and venue stakeholders. This unique governance model required both a tactile and delicate approach for him to manage the differing state and national squash agendas. At times, in conflict with his interstate peers, Paul maintained his focus to ensure player and participation development at all levels, as well as venue operator viability. He was a pioneer and visionary in many aspects. He promoted innovative concepts to expand squash's appeal and reach with an innate ability to be an entrepreneur, confidant, promoter, administrator, marketer, media liaison, as well as being politically savvy. Soon after Melbourne's Perk Street Mall was built in the 70s, Paul set up the first all-perspex court in the mall, promoting and spruiking squash in the open air for 5 days before a Melbourne City Council officially inquired whether he had a permit. Paul hadn't applied for one, and he then removed the court the next day as he had already achieved his objective of promoting squash to a broader public. Pioneers often encounter barriers to reach their goals and being ahead of his time. Paul was required to resolve many challenges, often at his own financial risk. The 1980s was a time when squash was emerging in America and new variations evolved, including racquetball, a game with a bigger and bouncier ball, a game that was easier to play than squash. Paul saw the potential for racquetball as an introduction to squash for juniors, in a way of prolonging participation for older players as they slowed down, a strategy that would both increase participation and generate additional revenue for venues. He followed up by organising racquetball tournaments in Victoria and repeated that in South Australia and New South Wales. Paul's influence laid the foundations for emerging junior players in the late 70s. Through the Australian Squash Court Owners Association, he created the Cheezels Junior Squash Championships, a national multi-level squash event that included club, regional, state and the national championships. This event laid the foundation for what became the Australian Junior Age Championships. Many junior players who cut their teeth in the Cheezels event in the 70s and 80s went on to become world-ranked senior players, and during the 90s and 2000s, they competed in events in Australia that were created and promoted by Paul. Paul was the driving force behind squash being accepted as a core sport of the Victorian Institute of Sport, which is VIS, program. His vision always included support for increased participation at all levels through the elite levels. He initiated a pathway for all players before pathways became a common term in sport. He led the panel which prepared the submission to the VIS and then attended various interviews that led to the success of the bid. It was one of only 7 sports accepted as core sports in that initial intake. That led to a nearly 20-year tenure as a VIS sport, and which provided valuable assistance to Victoria's and some of Australia's best junior and senior players throughout that period. I believe Sarah was a member of that. He wrote articles for media outlets, carried out radio and television interviews, wrote for the Squash and SNRV newsletter about past players, and always acknowledged the achievements of others involved in our sports. Paul also established the Australian National League, relaunched the Australian Open using the all-glass court in high-volume seat arenas, and staged all-glass court tournaments in open air shopping centres, including the Daimaru Shopping Centre. During the 90s, leading to squash having its first ever outdoor public space viewing arena. His pioneering also encompassed international squash events, This included hosting the 95 World Masters Squash Championships in Melbourne, an event that involved approximately 1,200 players from many countries. That success led to other opportunities. He shall forever be remembered for being the catalyst for Melbourne to develop and host an international festival of squash, which is the Melbourne 2001 International Squash Festival. The bid to host the Melbourne 2001 International Squash Festival, a combination of World Squash Championships and a number of squash-related conferences and exhibitions supporting them, was co-presented by Paul to the World Squash Federation at its 1997 annual general meeting in South Africa. This concept that Paul advocated for had not previously been considered, and it captured the imagination of the attending delegates who saw its potential. Despite various other bids from international destinations to host individual components of the Melbourne bid was successful. For 3 weeks in 2001, Melbourne was home to the World Squash Federation, Women's International Squash Players Association, Professional Squash Players Association, national bodies, as well as officials from throughout the world. The festival included 3 World Championship events, more than 1,000 players, plus various international seminars and conferences focused on squash referees and officials were held. That concept of Paul's, which has not been considered previously because of its grand scale and cost, has never been repeated. Paul was the assistant competitions manager of the Melbourne 2006 Commonwealth Games squash event. Along with a team of staff and volunteers, Paul worked tirelessly to deliver a very successful event at MSAC. His retirement from the Victorian Squash Federation in 2008 allowed him to refocus on racquetball, and in a voluntary capacity, he established racquetball to be a sport that is played throughout the country, and in some locations, it is more popular than squash. Considering squash is supported by Squash Australia and the various state associations, all with paid staff and volunteer boards, Paul's achievements as an unpaid volunteer were amazing. As well as the general administration of racquetball within Australia, he attended all of the tournaments, compiled ranking points, and submitted articles to media outlets. He coordinated an extensive review of the Australian racquetball rules and became the secretary of the Victorian Racquetball Committee established by Squash and Racquetball Victoria. In reality, he was the glue that held the racquetball community together. His influence also extended to other states, culminating in the National Racquetball Grand Prix Circuit and the National Racquetball Committee. These efforts contributed much to the well-being of Australians keen to maintain a level of fitness and enjoy a healthy and active lifestyle. In 2019, he was appointed to the Squash and Racquetball Victoria Board, and he accepted the role of secretary. In 2020, with the new board, he did not stand for a board position. On the sudden resignation of the GM, he was asked to act as interim GM. He accepted that role and then successfully applied for various levels of funding from the state government and VIC Health to ensure the survival of Squash and Racquetball Victoria. He continued in that role throughout the challenges of COVID until recently. His heart and soul was always focused on supporting squash and racquetball, and at the time of his passing, he was writing the history of squash in Victoria. He shall be forever missed by those who knew him well. We shall never forget Paul's fervent support and recognition of the many volunteers throughout both squash and racquetball. He was convinced that the lifeblood of the sports relied on volunteers being well trained, always acknowledged and always supported. He would always view the roles of volunteers as being as important as any of his salaried staff. We also will never forget his wonderful sense of humour. He could tell a very funny story, and on many occasions he would laugh so much at what he was saying that he had difficulty in finishing his story. Paul's passing attracted tributes from many, including the World Squash Federation and Squash Australia, along with many more from people scattered throughout the squash world, including Jeff Hunt, who was obviously 8 times British Open champion, Dean Williams, former world number 3, Heather Deaton, Hong Kong squash, former vice president of the World Squash Federation, Ricky Hill, former world number 10, Carol Owens, 2 times world champion, and Andrew Shelley, former CEO of England Squash, and now owner of the World Squash Library. Paul was and remains a true legend of both squash and racquetball. First up to Paul, his son Ryan, who's with us tonight to say a few words about his dad.
Thank you. I'm just thinking, leading on from what Dennis spoke about with the all-glass court. I remember as a kid dressing up as Hardy Hart for the Hart Foundation, walking around Melbourne Central. And it was pretty scary on those escalators as a little kid. But I'm pretty sure I remember him telling me on the last day they had, I think, Darren James from the radio station, and had the finals coming out. I'm pretty sure they didn't have a permit for that either. So it was the security guard that was questioning him. He gave him some answer, and yeah, they got to finish and get it down. But it reminds me, a few months before Dad passed, we were sitting at the table there, and I said to Dad, I think there's a few things there might be one thing I know more about squash than you. And he looked at me with a cheeky grin, and he like scoffed and said, "Go on then," you know. And I said, "Well, you've put squash court in Melbourne Central, and you've put, there's been a squash court over in the desert." And I said, "But did you know there's an underwater squash court?" And he's like looked at me and he said, "There's no underwater squash court." And I said, "There is. It's sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic." And he's like questioning, he's like looking at me, and I said, "There was one on the Titanic." And so I said, it's still there, it might be in pieces. But yeah, it was, anything about squash or racquetball, I always knew, definitely have Dad's attention, because it was his life, he just loved it. But it was because of the people that he worked with and those volunteers that Dennis mentioned. He said to me, you find something that you love to do and you'll never work a day in your life. And I just, thanks also to Bert Armstrong, who took me across before to look at the squash memorabilia over there. When you mentioned it in Brisbane, like I said, I didn't know the size or the scale of what you've done. But interestingly, over there among all the squash memorabilia is a little playbook that you mentioned from the Titanic sister ship. And, just things like that I just find amazing in that history. And but yeah, you've done an amazing job over there, and I think that's something, that a lot of people coming through should see if you haven't gone over there and looked.
Excuse me, Paul had a great impact on my collection there. He was terrific. I spent a lot of time with him.
Yeah, no, and he mentioned, mentioned some of the stuff that you'd done. Again, and probably it was a lot less than what's there now, and but I never knew the scale of it. So it's an amazing thing. So thank you for showing me that. I really appreciate it. Anyway, I've written a few notes. I'm probably not going to be as funny as Dad was, so I'll just keep it short and sweet, just to talk about this award and what it means. The Paul Weir Award is an accolade that both honours the legacy of my late father, Paul Weir, and celebrates the ongoing dedication of individuals who continue to enrich both squash and racquetball. In these moments of tribute and celebration, we honour not only the game, but also those individuals who shaped it. Their passion, their dedication, and their unwavering commitment. Their legacy is woven into every rally, every victory, and every defeat, guiding and inspiring those who followed in their footsteps. Paul was not only a sports administrator, but he was a pioneer in fostering unity between these two incredible sports. His tireless service transcended the court, emphasising the harmony and complementary nature of both squash and racquetball. He believed wholeheartedly that these sports were not competitors but allies, each offering unique elements that enrich the world of the racket sports. This accolade symbolises more than individual excellence. It embodies the legacy of champions both past and present. It echoes the depth of our shared history, celebrating the resilience and unwavering spirit of those who have graced this sport. It's a testament that extends far beyond the confines of the award itself, embodying the very essence of our sport's enduring legacy. A legacy built on passion, dedication, and the indomitable human spirit. As we gather to honour this year's recipient, a paragon of dedication akin to Paul's commitment to both squash and racquetball, and legacy of unwavering dedication, passion, and the fortitude that defines the sport's timeless journey. This awardee, much like the symbolism of the Titanic's depths, embodies the profound depths to which they have gone to elevate and define the beloved sport. I'll hand you back over to Dennis to present the award.
So those who would be considered for the award would need to demonstrate a commitment to our sports over decades, be very much a team player, be fully aware of the importance of the Victorian regions as well as city-based interests, a willingness to travel anywhere in Victoria, enjoy a significant number and depth of squash and racquetball relationships, and have an appreciation to complementary roles of squash and racquetball. If I read out his achievements again, we're going to be here till breakfast, so I'm not going to read the same achievements, because you've heard it tonight, the winner is Peter Wright.
Yeah.
I really can't believe this. Going back after those beautiful words about Paul and all what he'd done, he was a very close friend of mine, and we, as I mentioned earlier, we were both tennis players and we started squash, and we were both in the squash centres. So parallel, we worked for a long, long time, and in later years, coming back to Squash VIC, when Paul put up his hand when we had the need, it was just amazing that he gave all that time up and dedication for all of us. I could tell plenty of stories when we went overseas trying to promote a Masters event, particularly 95 and in 2001. The achievement of Paul, we talked about it and put that together, open squash and particularly the Masters. And I know Master Squash had 1,800 entries, and that was really contributing to Paul and all the work that was done. It's something that no one will ever achieve again, I'm quite sure. But the dedication of Paul, and we all know the people that knew Paul, it was just amazing. And to lose Paul like we did was a very sad note for squash and racquetball. But this is a really honour. I can't say any more words, but I'm very thankful. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, looks like